No speeches, no declarations, just actions that left the world speechless. That night, Iran chose silence, but it was not the silence of weakness or hesitation. It was the silence of power, deliberate, strategic, and impossible to ignore. The world, accustomed to loud threats, fiery speeches, and endless warnings, suddenly found itself in uncharted territory when a nation known for resilience and defiance decided not to shout, not to boast, but simply to act. The silence became deafening. The superpowers expected noise, a statement, a declaration, something they could respond to. Instead, they got quiet precision. And in that quietness, Iran forced the world to listen. Silence became a language, a form of communication that carried more weight than words ever could. It wasn't just about what Iran did, but about what it didn't say. The unspoken message was clear: we do not need to explain ourselves, and we do not need your recognition to prove our strength. The media scrambled for explanations. Leaders searched for answers. Analysts debated what it meant. Yet the message was already written in history. That silence can shake the halls of power more than explosions, that restraint can demand attention more than aggression. It was a masterclass in strategy, showing that dominance is not only about striking, but about controlling the narrative without uttering a single word. That night wasn't just about Iran. It was about a shift in how the world understands power. It was a reminder that real strength is not always loud, and that sometimes silence itself becomes the most unshakable roar. Silence has always been misunderstood in global politics. To many, it is seen as hesitation, weakness, or uncertainty. But the night Iran chose silence, it redefined the very concept of power. Instead of loud warnings or fiery declarations, Iran let its silence speak. And in that silence, the world heard a message louder than missiles. The absence of words was not an absence of strength, but rather a demonstration of absolute control. It showed that Iran did not need to explain, justify, or beg for acknowledgement. Its actions, carefully measured and deliberately quiet, carried a weight that words could never match. Superpowers are used to narratives they can control. When an opponent speaks, they analyze, twist, and respond. But silence is different. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds fear. By not filling the air with words, Iran left others to wonder, predict, and second-guess. This unpredictability became more powerful than any speech, because it forced the world to listen without interruption, to pay attention without distraction. The silence also shifted the battlefield from military might to psychological dominance. It reminded the world that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with perception. In choosing silence, Iran proved that it could control not just its own message, but the global conversation. Suddenly, analysts, politicians, and media outlets were left to fill the gaps, unintentionally amplifying Iran's position without Iran ever having to say a single word. That night, silence became strategy. It was no longer about who had the louder voice, but who had the power to remain silent while still being heard. And in that balance, Iran demonstrated a new form of influence, one that redefined strength on the world stage. On the global stage, uncertainty is often feared. Nations spend billions trying to predict outcomes, calculate strategies, and control narratives. But on that night, Iran turned uncertainty into its sharpest weapon. By refusing to declare its next move, it left rivals in a state of unease. Would there be retaliation? Would silence break into sudden action? Or was the quiet itself the endgame? The lack of clarity forced the world's most powerful players to wait, and in waiting, they lost control of the tempo. Superpowers thrive on dominance, on dictating the pace of events. Yet, when uncertainty takes hold, that dominance begins to fracture. Iran's silence disrupted the predictability that global powers rely on. With no words to dissect and no official statements to anchor their analysis, intelligence agencies and military strategists were left grasping at shadows. Every move became speculation, every interpretation an assumption, and that confusion itself became a form of leverage. Uncertainty has a psychological toll. The inability to predict generates anxiety, and anxiety weakens decision-making. By withholding words and letting silence stretch across the globe, Iran made its rivals nervous not about what had happened, but about what could happen next. This anticipation created an invisible pressure more effective than open threats. In that moment, Iran showed that silence was not passive but active, a force that could destabilize without a single missile fired. Instead of being cornered, Iran placed its rivals in a defensive posture, waiting, hesitating, and second-guessing. What looked like absence was actually presence in its most strategic form. It was a masterstroke in psychological warfare, where silence transformed from a void into a weapon that unsettled the world's most powerful nations. Throughout history, power has often been measured by how loud a nation can roar, through speeches, warnings, or displays of force. But Iran, on that unforgettable night, demonstrated that true defiance does not always come from sound but from silence. By choosing not to speak, not to declare, and not to justify, Iran made a bold statement. It owed the world no explanations. This silence was not weakness, it was resistance in its purest form. When countries are accused, pressured, or threatened, the typical response is either denial or escalation. Silence, however, breaks this pattern entirely. It creates a space that cannot be countered with propaganda or dismissed as rhetoric. Iran's refusal to speak deprived its rivals of ammunition. There were no words to twist, no speeches to analyze, and no declarations to measure against reality. What remained was only the action itself, stripped of any narrative manipulation. This silence was also deeply unsettling because it represented control. To remain quiet in the face of overwhelming global scrutiny requires discipline and confidence. It conveyed the message that Iran was not desperate for validation, nor intimidated by the weight of international pressure. Silence became a way of saying, "We act on our terms, not yours." In global politics, silence often echoes louder than words. It forces adversaries to interpret, speculate, and worry. That night, Iran's silence became a wall, impenetrable and unshakable. It was a refusal to play the game of public declarations, a rejection of the idea that power must always shout to be recognized. By embracing silence, Iran redefined defiance, showing that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that chooses not to speak. That night was not just about military actions or strategic positioning. It was about the psychological impact that silence had on the world's most powerful nations. For decades, superpowers have dictated the global narrative. They expected loud threats, fiery speeches, or overt challenges from any nation daring to stand against them. Instead, what they faced from Iran was silence, and that silence unsettled them more than words ever could. Silence stripped away their ability to control the story. Normally, leaders and media outlets would seize on statements, analyze them, spin them, and use them as tools to manipulate public perception. But with nothing said, there was nothing to grasp. All that remained were actions, raw, undeniable, and beyond interpretation. This created a psychological vacuum, a space filled with uncertainty and unease. The superpowers, used to leading the conversation, suddenly found themselves reacting instead of dictating. Their strength lies not only in military might, but in controlling global narratives. Iran's silence cut off that power. It was a reminder that dominance is not only about weapons or wealth, it is about the ability to unsettle your opponent's confidence. The silence forced the superpowers into an uncomfortable position. They had to guess Iran's intentions, calculate Iran's patience, and prepare for what might come next. And in that guessing, they revealed their own vulnerabilities. Silence made them cautious. Silence made them doubt. Silence forced them to confront the reality that for all their strength, they could not predict or control a nation that refused to play by their rules. In that moment, the balance of fear shifted. The psychological blow Iran delivered through silence was more powerful than any direct strike, because it left the strongest nations in the world speechless themselves. That night marked a turning point in how the world understood power itself. For decades, power was measured by who had the largest armies, the most advanced weapons, or the loudest voices on the global stage. But Iran, by choosing silence instead of noise, demonstrated a deeper truth. Real power is not always about what is displayed, but about what is withheld. Silence became strategy. It redefined power as the ability to control perception, to dictate the pace of events without uttering a word, and to remind the world that restraint can be as forceful as action. Superpowers were left uneasy because silence denied them the usual cycle of provocation and retaliation. By doing less, Iran achieved more. By saying nothing, it made the world say everything on its behalf. This was not weakness. It was strength in its purest form. Silence became a weapon sharper than missiles because it exposed how reliant the global order is on predictable responses. Iran broke that pattern. It showed that power can lie in patience, in unpredictability, and in the ability to leave even the mightiest nations questioning what will come next. The silence also redefined respect. Countries around the world saw that Iran had chosen discipline over chaos, control over desperation. That in itself was a message. one that spoke to allies, rivals, and neutral nations alike. It was a reminder that true power does not always need to roar. Sometimes, it only needs to whisper or remain silent. In the end, that night proved that missiles may shake the ground, but silence can shake the world order. Power was no longer just about dominance. It was about control, patience, and the ability to make the entire globe lean in, waiting for the next move. In a world ruled by noise, threats, speeches, and endless declarations, silence became Iran's greatest weapon. That night was not just a chapter in politics, it was a lesson in strategy, power, and perception. Without firing a single shot, without speaking a single word, Iran made the strongest nations pause. That pause, that hesitation, was proof enough that the balance of power had shifted. The superpowers realized something they never expected: silence can be louder than any missile, more powerful than any army, and more lasting than any headline. It forced them to acknowledge a truth they had long ignored, that dominance is not just about force, but about control of the moment, control of fear, and control of perception. What happened that night was more than a standoff. It was a turning point that reminded the world that strength is not always measured in weapons or words, but in the ability to make others listen without speaking. And long after the noise of politics fades, the silence of that night will echo in history. A silence that proves sometimes the quietest move can shake the loudest powers.